Good evening. And just a technical check. Should I see myself on the monitor in here in the studio? Okay, very good. All right. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for waiting to tune in to another edition of What Do You Think? Today is Thursday, October 14th, 2021. And again, I apologize for the delay in getting on the air. Hopefully, it'll be worth sticking around and waiting for the program to air. This is a call-in program. I'll remind you, if you would like to call in and participate, please feel free to do so. Later on at the bottom of the screen, you will see the contact information through Zoom so that you can participate on air. So again, you're more than welcome. I wanted to speak this evening about the notion of a free lunch and of increasing the debt to pay for a free lunch. But before that, I wanted to just briefly discuss something that is particular, an issue that has been particular to Bellows Falls, in particular familiar to people who know the intersection of Atkinson and School Streets here in Bellows Falls. I'm talking, of course, about the address 66 Atkinson Street, the former YMCA, Meeting Waters YMCA building, and for many, many decades before that, since 1835, the First Methodist Church here in Bellows Falls. 1835, historic building. It was probably one of the first structures erected in this neighborhood and has stood decaying for at least the last 20 years. About 3 or I'm going to say 4 years ago, the property was sold to an individual associated with the Bellows Falls Historical Society. And that individual bought the church building for the sum of $1. And over the last 4 years, we have come to learn that there is no funding, and without funding, there is no plan to redevelop the property and to transform it into something positive for the community. There never was, as far as I know, a business plan presented, certainly not during the course of the sale. And because of a deteriorating seam along the eaves on the School Street side, for the last 2 years approximately, the street side and the front of the church have been blocked off with jersey barriers and chain link fence to keep people off the sidewalk, which runs directly underneath the damaged eaves, which over the last 18 months has steadily been growing. The gap between the roof and the eaves, or the section between the roof edge and the upper wall, has been growing for the last, as I said, 18 months. And aside from plywood, there has been, from the outside, noticeably not much done. There have been various inspections from building professionals and the fire department, and an engineer has stated that the property poses a threat to its neighbors and to people obviously walking underneath. And since there has been no plan or funding coming forward from the individual who bought the building for $1, the town is, through the village trustees and the select board, is preparing to demolish the building. There was perhaps 1/11th hour attempt by another organization to rescue the building and to take it off of the individual's hands. but that fell through, and so by the end of September, the town was stuck where it was 2 years ago with the prospect of an empty building that is deteriorating, that is posing a threat to its neighbors, people walking by on public sidewalks. And so plans have been going through to get an estimate as to the demolition costs, and also some discussion as to what will replace the church when it does come down. Now, my thoughts on this is I would concur with Elijah Zimmer, who's on the Historical Society, and also I believe he's a village trustee. If he's not, then I apologize. And I agree that it's a shame. I believe this could have been avoided with better planning. You open the door to many negative possibilities when you sell a property that has a prominent location for $1 without requiring funding and a business plan to redevelop that property. That was irresponsible of the YMCA to sell the property under those without that stipulation, and it was irresponsible of the individual to buy that property for $1 without a plan, without a business plan, and without funding in place or funding about to be secured within a reasonable time. 4 years have gone by and no action aside from paying taxes. And this reminds me of a similar case. Those of you who were around in the 70s, adults in the 70s, may remember a railroad bridge, an important railroad bridge for freight coming into New England on the New Haven Railroad, later the Penn Central Railroad. This was the Poughkeepsie Rail Bridge. And the Poughkeepsie Rail Bridge had a fire in 1974. And through lack of maintenance, through a lack of proper management, fire barrels had been thrown off the bridge or pushed off the bridge and never replenished. In other words, we're talking about a steel bridge with timber on it from the ties and the subtrack infrastructure that rests on steel girders. Steel girders obviously are not going to burn, but certainly the subtrack wooden structure coated with creosote to protect the ties, the wood from rot, will burn. And they had water barrels or fire barrels every couple of 100 feet on little platforms along the right-of-way. This is a long bridge. This bridge is at least a mile long over what is a somewhat wide section of the Hudson River going east to west. The bridge caught fire. There's question as to whether or not the fire was intentionally set. The fire barrels were missing or were empty, having been tipped over. There was no firefighting system in place, not like you would send out some type of a truck and hook up to a hydrant. There had been inadequate maintenance, fire prevention maintenance on the bridge, and so it burned. And the Penn Central, which was at that time in '74 losing something like $17 for every second of operation. Let that sink in. A company that loses $17 every second. And it had been doing that for a couple of years. Decided they could not afford to rebuild the bridge, and so the freight was channeled or through Selkirk, which is just outside of Albany, and they chose another route for the bridge traffic through Massachusetts as opposed to Connecticut. So that bridge went to Conrail when Conrail was formed in '76 from Penn Central and other bankrupt Northeast freight carriers. And Conrail sold that bridge for $1 to an individual as well. Different individual. We're not talking the same person 45 years later. But Conrail sold the bridge for $1, and guess what? The navigation lights on the bridge stopped working, and the Coast Guard tried to get in touch with whoever was the owner of the bridge to say, you have to fix the navigation lights because we have freight traffic and your bridge is an obstruction. Well, it took a while for the Coast Guard to figure out that the owner was not reachable, not cooperative, obviously, and it took a while for the bridge to fall into the state's hands. The lights invariably were fixed, and the navigation lights on the piers supporting the bridge. And the bridge, the Poughkeepsie Bridge, was stabilized to the point where they put down a boardwalk of planks. They removed the railroad tracks. There were 2 tracks. I think one was actually out of service at the time of the fire. They removed the tracks, and now you can walk across the Hudson River on the Poughkeepsie Rail Bridge, one of those Rails to Trails initiatives, and it's quite stunning. You're probably about, I'd say, 15 to 20 stories above the water. It is very high. It's a high bridge. Anyway, that happened, and again, property, very prominent, very impactful on its environment, was sold for $1. So anyway, getting back to 66 Atkinson Street, the individual who bought the church at 66 Atkinson for $1 roughly 4 years ago signed the church property over to the town of Rockingham. And so now the town has recently, through a meeting, decided they would accept one bid from a company in Walpole for $58,000 to knock the church down, to crush it, I think were the words used in the article. Now, crush means you do not salvage anything. You just pulverize the structure, and the entire structure material gets carted away to a landfill. Not exactly recycling, and I find it strange that we recycle cans and bottles, cardboard, but we don't recycle buildings. We just knock them down. And I find that very ironic and kind of a double standard, I think. But anyway, thanks to some people that see the value of history and of the materials that were used in the construction of this building, there is an effort, or the contract was approved for demolition with the stipulation in the form of a resolution that the steeple, I believe, be salvaged, the stained glass window in the front of the church facing Atkinson Street be salvaged, and where it's possible, the timber framing of the church be salvaged. We're talking timber frames that are roughly 16 inches by 16 inches. They are huge. And if you think of the early, virgin growth forests that supplied this wood, the trees that supplied the wood, and then the milling, the sawmilling that it took to take these trees, huge trees, giant trees, and put them into a timber framework. And then peg that all together, which was the practice 180 years ago. It's quite impressive. So There will be an effort by the contractor to salvage the windows, the steeple, some other material, the timbers. But if there is a additional cost, and of course there will be, then that cost has to be approved by the select board at the next meeting. So it's an ongoing process, but the church is coming down. It's just a question of how much of it will be salvaged. The contractor will knock it down. This is not this is not dismantling where you take apart the building as it was constructed, but this is taking a rather large crane and knocking it down. I have a feeling, despite the roof issues, it will be a hard building to knock down because of the integrity of the construction and the massive size of the wood timbers that were used in building it. I think it's going to turn out to be another arch bridge, whereby they tried dynamiting the arch bridge 2 or 3 times. It did not come down because, contrary to an engineering study that said it must be replaced, the bridge had quite a few more years left in it. And so I think there's quite a few more years left in this structure. It's just unfortunate that there is no demand for its retention, for its preservation. Certainly no demand whereby there's a business plan with funding to repurpose this church and save this landmark, which is, and I'd say, one of the top 10 landmarks in Bellows Falls, if not maybe the top 20 landmarks in Bellows Falls, and we're going to be losing it. So anyway, enough about that. We'll see what happens. The plan is to demolish. Again, demolish, not dismantle, but demolish, to crush the building after before the first snowfall. So we're talking sometime probably by Thanksgiving we should see some activity at the corner of Atkinson and School Street. My thoughts are, I hope that somebody steps forward with some plan to help with the salvaging the timbers. You'd think there would be value in the timbers. I just hope that our Board of Selectmen, our town manager, and our Board of Trustees and the local historical society from Bellows Falls have sent the word out to people whose business it is to dismantle and salvage barns and other large buildings, to do the same for this church, so that it does not go into a landfill in its entirety. And we do give some type of a tip of the hat to our forefathers and foremothers, and to a part of the town that is bedrock to the community. And I think architecture is definitely a defining characteristic of any town. Certainly this church is for the village of Bellows Falls. So anyway, moving on, the main topic of tonight's program was no free lunch. And I came across this because I'm sure if you've been listening to the news or watching the news, there's been discussion about increasing the debt ceiling. In other words, especially over the last year and a half through COVID and COVID relief programs, we've increased the debt. In other words, we don't have the additional money to spend through these rescue programs or other grant or other programs or entities, subsidies, whatever. So we borrow, and right now the debt is in the trillions. We're approaching, I think, about $25 trillion in debt. Many people would say, so what, let's just print some more money. Reminds me, going back again to the 70s, Saturday Night Live had a program, I think it was during 78 or 79, Jimmy Carter was president, And again, those of you who were adults during that period, or maybe even younger people, remember inflation. Inflation was a big issue, rising gas prices. If you're old enough, you'll know that gas was maybe 35, 50, 60 cents a gallon at one point in the early 70s, and now was climbing up, fueling inflation as it has done in part today. And so they had someone mimicking Jimmy Carter on the phone, and he's on the phone with the Federal Reserve. And he says, "Hi, this is Jimmy. I'd like to throw a party for America, and I was wondering if you could print up some 20s, definitely some 50s and 100s, and let's get this country moving again." It was a joke, but it seems we're rounding that corner again. We are printing more money. We are printing paper money to the point where change is less and less relevant. By change, I mean coinage. And if you've done any shopping or been to the gas pump over the last, I'd say since February, you've noticed that prices have been going up. Generally, what happens is when fuel prices go up, propane, gasoline, diesel fuel, other prices go up because things move by truck or by train, and these engines are run by jet fuel. In the case of planes, diesel fuel for trucks and diesel fuel for trains. And so everything that starts going up. People have not been coming back to work because they've been paid to stay at home in many cases. And so employers are had to offer more pay to entice people to work for them. And that also is making costs go higher because that increased wage that the person is making is going to be passed along to you, the buyer. It's interesting because in all this, we haven't talked about a $15 minimum wage yet, but I think we're going to be reaching that naturally, given the trend that's been developing over the last, I'd say, 7 or 8 months. Now, not everybody in the Senate is in favor of raising the debt, raising the level of borrowing so that we can continue funding such programs as the $3.4 trillion infrastructure plan that President Biden and Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders and Vermont Senator Patrick Leahy have been pushing. So one senator on the other side of the aisle, a Republican from Kentucky, Rand Paul, believes that raising the debt ceiling and raising spending, whether it's for infrastructure or whether it's for foreign aid, whatever, or whether it's for unemployment compensation so that people can stay at home instead of work, that there's going to be a stage where we kind of jeopardize what's left in the bank because we borrowed so heavily. From what I understand, pensions have been depleted, and I guess Social Security will be maintained only through printing more money. Well, anyway, if we're ready in the control room, if we could roll that 4-minute video from Rand Paul in which he speaks before his colleagues on the dangerous trend of raising the debt ceiling and continuing to increase our borrowing to pay for the programs that people have become used to or feel now entitled to.
Rapidly approaching a milestone in our country, and it's not a good one. We're rapidly approaching $30 trillion in debt. We're accumulating debt like we never have at any time in our history. We're actually accumulating debt at the rate of over $2 million per minute. Now, some say deficits don't matter. Some on the left say they have this new monetary theory. We can just print it all up. You can all have free stuff. There'll be manna from heaven, and nothing could go wrong. We're just going to give you money. If not $1,400 checks a month or a year, why don't we give you monthly checks? And that's part of the new plans. The new plans of the $3.5 trillion that we're, facing down at this point, that'll all be borrowed, is to give people free money, to give people free this, free that. But I think people are smarter than that. I think people know that ultimately you don't get anything in life without hard work. You don't get anything in life really for free. Isn't there some kind of ramification to so much borrowed money? When someone comes to you and says, or they call you on the phone and they say, here's $1,000, all you got to do is sign up for this. Most people immediately recoil and they say, well, that might be a scam. Somebody's going to be ripping me off to say that. Well, it's sort of the bait and switch of the politics we face now. People are saying, we're going to give you free college, free cars, free cell phones, free this, free that. Everything in life will be free. You won't have to work anymore. The problem is there are ramifications. Money doesn't grow on trees. The money's got to come from somewhere. So either we borrow it, we become more indebted to foreign countries, we tax people for it, or ultimately the way we fix a lot of our deficit problems is we simply print the money. And so when the Federal Reserve prints the money, as we increase the money supply, the money that we have becomes worth less and less. It loses its purchasing power. This is the insidious tax of inflation. And the interesting thing about it is inflation is a regressive tax. It doesn't affect everyone the same. In fact, the tax of inflation actually affects the working class, the people of lower incomes, and those on fixed incomes and pension, retirees. It affects them much worse because they don't have the ability for their income to go up. So right now we're facing 5% inflation because of the massive borrowing that really both parties instituted in the last year. They decided that the result to the pandemic would be to close everything down, destroy the economy, and then give everyone free money. And to a large extent, both parties actually did this last year. Now this year, the decision has been made by Republicans to say, whew, this is so much, we got to stop. We got to get people back to work and let the economy recover. So it's primarily been Democrats this year. But both parties have a certain responsibility to this, at least some members of both parties. But as the inflation occurs, and this effect is being transmitted to the economy, you find that those who suffer are those who cannot raise their income, those who have fixed income or low income. One of the things you see here is that if we have 5% inflation, what does that mean? You say, well, I don't know, that means I lose my purchasing power by 5% next year. But what if it happens year in, year out for a decade, and you've lost 50% of your purchasing power? It means to make up for that you really have to have a 50% increase in your wages. So will wages keep up with inflation? The dirty little secret is that in some ways wages will rise, but maybe they rise an equivalent amount or a little bit less, and you say a decade later, I'm not any better off. And there become people mired and more dependent on government as government gets larger and larger, and they think they're getting free stuff, but it's not really free. The allure of something for nothing. This is the allure of socialism. This is a false allure. It's something that you're going to be able to get something and you're not going to have to pay for it.
Thank you for, there we go. Thank you for playing that clip. Again, that was Rand Paul speaking in the Senate House, bringing to his colleagues' attention, Democrat and Republican, his concern about a trend of increased borrowing and continually raising the debt ceiling so that we can borrow more money to pay for things that we cannot afford. The issue that I find interesting is that as people in the middle class shrinks or is weakened in its buying power through inflation, which now is roughly 5% when you figure in fuel, food, clothing. Everything has gone up in price. It's just about that we need to purchase, and evens out at about 5% over the last month or so. Is as that 5% continues and is compounded, and our buying power or our buying freedom to pick up what we need, food, clothing, housing, and keeping the house comfortable, decreases a little bit as inflation continues to gallop along. And the short fix is to borrow money and give people more funding so that the costs are offset, offering free tuition in college, offering free daycare for children, offering free transportation, etc., or subsidizing your light bill, your gas bill. And especially with people who are living on a limited income, pensioners, older people who want to remain in their homes. That is indeed manna from heaven. It's a godsend. The local Vermont weatherization program is a godsend. It helps in dealing with fuel costs by making living quarters more energy efficient. The only trouble is, as we go decade to decade in the dependence on government largesse or government grants or subsidies continues, we become less and less self-reliant as individuals, as families, as communities, and we're kind of stuck on the tit, so to speak, of what comes out of Washington. And the initiative to help ourselves diminishes. And what may be available today may not be available tomorrow. I know in education that's definitely the case when you have grants that are good for 2 years and then they dry up. It should never, if the model is that most people cannot survive for their minimal needs with the structure we have, the work structure, well, then maybe there needs to be some adjustment. I'm not saying increasing taxes on the rich, which is one avenue that's being addressed. Increase taxes on the rich. The trouble is when you increase taxes on the rich, they take their money to a safe haven in the Caribbean or somewhere else, and the money is out of the reach of the U.S. tax person. The IRS does not see any of that. So it sounds good to tax the rich, but the rich are not going to let you tax them. Certainly not the upper 2%. So the simplistic approach of more taxing to pay for what we can't afford is short-term and very short-term and short-sighted. So perhaps we should look at exactly what the government offers and start from scratch, what they call a zero budget, and say, well, what do we absolutely need in order to keep people from going hungry or keep people employed? I think it may be time to have a fresh look at a zero budget, start from scratch. I think a lot of our spending gets diluted through bills that become law, whereby, sure, we help people whose businesses have been closed because of the pandemic, because of illness, people who have lost their jobs with unemployment compensation, but the same bill also includes money for foreign aid, which is not part of what the response to Americans should be. I would venture to say that the infrastructure bill, the relief bill, both those bills, which have cost in the trillions of dollars, have included a certain amount of what they call pork, special pet projects that do not fall in line with the goal of helping Americans economically that have lost their jobs or their businesses. And it's really a disservice to the taxpayer or to the voter or any American, because often these expenditures are not seen in a bill that's thousands of pages long. Occasionally, a news outlet will tap into some expenditure, and for shock value, they will put this on the air to get people riled, but it does little to look at the trend of where money is being misspent or who is getting rich from these entitlements. It's a complicated picture, but I think the way the budget is put together, the way we have these relief bills, which are a smorgasbord of whatever somebody wants in order for their vote to go in favor of this bill, to make it a law and therefore free up the money, the borrowed money, that's not sustainable, and it's not fair to our children or our grandchildren, who are probably going to need, if we continue, they're going to need not only bigger wallets and purses, but they're going to need to carry around hundreds of dollars just to go, or cards to go in debt to pay for these expenditures that just keep rising, in part due to government spending, which has fueled inflation, and spending that is very often off target. The favorite that comes to my mind is and this was brought in the news when the COVID relief bill that covered the unemployment compensation and paying businesses to remain closed in an effort to cut the spread of COVID. That was the logic. Where was I? Oh, I was about to take a drink of water. This, it's not clear. It's not clear where the money is going, and you get all you do is get people riled up about $25 million going to Pakistan, so for gender studies. So it's, I mean, it's believable. I'm sure there's money for every interest group has pet projects, and to secure their vote, they get a piece of the pie. And the trouble is, though, the pie has gotten too big, and there's a mentality now of entitlement whereby I expect the government to do this for me, or I expect the government to take care of this, to bail us out. And in some cases, it's a good investment. For example, bailing out Chrysler turned out to be a good investment in the 70s because they paid us back plus. But very often, there is no return on the money spent, and it's definitely not helping the average American person. So I just, I concur. I think we need to look at how we can make Americans more self-reliant and able to help themselves without necessarily going to the government and creating a generational dependency that basically is just money to keep people fat, dumb, and happy. And again, as I said before, I have people neighbors that are in serious situations, and thank God there is help for them. But they are my neighbors. They are not. They are not a corporation. They are not a foreign government. And so I believe that there needs to be more scrutiny. There needs to be the revisiting of a zero budget when we look at what we spend money on. And the best place to start is locally. I don't think it's realistic to depend on Washington, D.C. for financial help. I also don't feel it's realistic to expect them to come up with solutions. I think the zero budgeting, the solutions need to come on a local level in our own households, with our school boards, with our Board of Selectmen, on a very local level so that we act more responsibly and ensure a higher degree of self-reliance whereby we take more responsibility than we have in the past for the situation we're in. So that's it for this evening. I want to thank you for tuning in, and thank you for your patience in waiting for the show to go on the air. I again hope that as much salvage is done at 66 Atkinson as possible. I hope that the building is not simply crushed and carried off to a landfill, that historic elements of the church building are salvaged, that the building is documented, that plans are put in place for a replacement of the building. I don't want to see a parking lot on a street corner. That's a bad urban planning. And I don't want to see a park. Well, no, I don't want to see a park. I really would rather see somebody come in there and start paying taxes with a business, because I believe it may be zoned commercial, or perhaps with housing, but housing that pays taxes, housing that, like the housing that's across the street from where I live, which is well managed and serves people that are responsible yet in need of assistance. So hopefully that will take place, the salvaging. And then also that I believe the votes are there to, the debt ceiling has been raised, and so once again, the 11th hour, we did the cop-out, and we're borrowing more money without being more responsible with what we're spending money on, spending money for things that we cannot afford, and for things that most of us don't even know we're buying. So anyway, I wish everybody a good weekend. Enjoy the nice fall weather we've been having. God bless, and hope you tune in next Thursday at 5:45. Take care. Cheers.